So it finally worked. Yay! It finally worked. Yay, it wasn't like the next thing I was gonna have to do was restart the whole computer because it wasn't recognizing the camera. And I think that I just leave the computer on too long and it kind of throws up at me whenever it's um, not reset. It's whatever it resets whenever it restarts. So that's what I think is going on. It needs that reset probably every day. But I don't like that because then I have to get rid of all my windows that I have open, which also slows it down because I have too many windows open. Yay, but I closed some of the programs while I was trying to do this. Anyway, um, closing more programs. So I see one person's on. Thank you for being there. I appreciate you. We appreciate you. Um, yeah, I do. I really do. So today we're going to start with bronze bow 10, but first um, we've got Mark chapter 10. Oh, ironic. I didn't plan that. Okay, so um, we've got Mark chapter 10, and then we've got bronze bow chapter 10, and we'll probably also read chapter 11. Although I am really sorry that we're getting started so late. I really want to start at 8 o'clock Central Time every single day. Um, that's my goal. And I wasn't ready. I didn't prepare in advance. The group they all did dinner at the barbecue um, at the picnic area, um, um, and I don't have an excuse because I was back in the room in plenty of time. And then we did some conducting practice and stuff, and in which I got to be somebody that was helping other people instead of like because I don't have to worry about my anthem. Yay! But some people get to do the anthem again. All right. So anyway, enough about me. Now we'll read the Bible. I'm still waiting for another person. I know there should be at least two people. I don't know why we only have one. Let me know if you're here. We're 3 minutes in now. Everybody said they were ready. Waiting on me. Waiting on you. Hurry up. Waiting on you. That's what our drill sergeants made us say whenever one person was late to formation. We said that at the position of the front leaning rest. That's the push-up position. And so we'd go down and we'd say, hurry up. We'd go up, waiting on you. Down, hurry up, waiting on you, until they got there. So that's how I learned how to do push-ups. All right, so I guess we'll just start with one person. We're 4 minutes in. Mom and JJ are here. Maybe Rebecca and Kimmy gave up because I took so long. So I apologize for that. All right, so I'll just start. This is Mark chapter 10 in the English Standard Version of the Bible. And he left there, which was probably Capernaum. I don't remember where there is, and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. Oh, look, now there's two people on. Perfect. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. And Pharisees came up in order to test him and asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? He answered them, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. And they were bringing children to him that he might touch them, and the disciples rebuked them. But when Jesus saw it, he was indignant and said to them, let the children come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it. And he took them in his arms and blessed them, laying his hands on them. And as he was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. And he said to them, teacher, all of these I have kept from my youth. And Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, you lack one thing. Go, sell all you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples were amazed at his words. But Jesus said to them again, children, how difficult is it to enter the kingdom of God? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. And they were exceedingly astonished and said to him, then who can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, with man it is impossible, but not with God, for all things are possible with God. Peter began to say to him, see, we have left everything and followed you. Jesus said, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, Call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, Take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, What do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, Go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. That's the end of chapter 10. So now we're going to read the Bronze Bow, chapter 10. But while I was reading that, my phone was like throwing up for a minute. So let me see what's going on here. Attachment, that's me. Yay. I look real excited in that. Okay, I don't know what was going on. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, it's whatever. All right, so Bronze Bow, chapter 10. So let's, and I haven't thought about I haven't thought about what to say about the basically Daniel and Joel went to go find Simon because he could come up with that part that they needed, and Simon didn't have it, but he had some money that the blacksmith in town owed him, so he said, get whatever it is that you need. Daniel came back, he fixed the dagger, Rush's dagger that had been broken, and he I think he's starting to realize that maybe Rush is not the way. So I don't know, but feel free to talk amongst yourselves in the chat or whatever. And I'm going to read now chapter 10. All right, so here we are. Abel the sentry brought the message to Daniel one sultry August morning, a single sentence scratched on a fragment of broken pottery. Your grandmother is dying, and signed Simon. The message had been in Abel's pocket for 3 days, no knowing how many times it had changed hands before reaching him. Better if it had never reached him at all, Daniel thought fiercely, thrusting it deep into his girdle pocket. For half the day he carried it about with him, saying nothing, the bit of clay weighing heavier and heavier till it dragged at him like a stone. Finally he showed the message to Rosh and set off down the mountain to the village. The door of his grandmother's house was bolted, and only silence answered his knock. As he stood uncertain in the road before the house, 2 women and then a feeble old man came hurrying from the nearest house. About time you came, one of the women scolded. They've been locked in there for 10 days. We don't know whether the old woman is alive or dead. Why didn't you break in? Daniel asked. The girl is possessed by devils, the old man answered. She will let nobody come near her. We tossed bread through the window, a woman added, but I'll have no more to do with it. Suppose the devils were let loose. My sister is harmless, Daniel told them impatiently. She could hurt no one, but probably none of them had even glimpsed his sister in all these years. He could see that he could expect no help from them. He looked up at the small high window, then he wrenched a portion of the ladder from the wall, braced it, and tried to peer into the house. He could see nothing but a patch of floor, There was no sound, but just as he turned away, he thought he caught the flicker of a shadow. Leah, he called, softly at first, then insistently. It's Daniel, your brother. Let me in. The shadow did not move again. Panic crept over him. What horror did that room contain? With all his heart he longed to run from this silent house, yet the fearful, demanding eyes of the three neighbors goaded on him. He had no choice. He would have to break down the door and go in. At the second thrust of his powerful shoulders, the hinges burst from the rotting frame, and he fell forward into foul-smelling darkness. Sunlight poured in behind him, lighting up a crouching figure with a mass of tangled yellow hair. For an instant Leah's eyes stared wildly from an ashen face. Then she darted away and coiled into a tight ball of fear against the wall. Where the girl had crouched on a pallet of straw lay a shrunken gray shape. Dread froze Daniel on the threshold. Then, to the shattering relief, his grandmother slowly turned her head. Daniel, you've come, she whispered. They were the last words he was to ever hear from her. Daniel drove away the two curious women and sent the old man for a doctor. He kicked the door all the way open and let fresh air into the damp, fetid room. He threw out the rat-gnawed loaves of bread that littered the floor. The doctor bent over the old woman and shook his head. Only her will has kept the life in her, he said. She has waited till you came. Let her go now, poor soul. Look to your sister instead, and see that she eats. Daniel had no knowledge of nursing. Clumsily, he spread a fresh bed of rushes and shifted the weightless old body. He walked to the well and filled the jar with water and bathed the hands, thin and dry as shriveled leaves. One of the neighbors called from the roadway and handed him a bowlful of broth and a clay dish of hot coals to light a fire. He piled straw into the hollow in the floor and built a fire against the damp. He tried to coax the old woman to take a sip of the broth. In all this time, Leah had not moved from the wall. Once or twice, from the corner of his eyes, he noticed that she had very slightly turned her head, and he suspected that she watched him from behind the tangled hair. He tried not to look at her, to crowd back the fear that rose in him at the sight of her disheveled figure. She had been shut in here in the dimness for 10 days. Had the devils taken possession of her altogether? Daniel went out into the garden and milked the little goat. Awkwardly, the feel of it gradually coming back into his hands, he carried the jar of milk into the house and set it on a shelf. The goat followed him through the broken door, sniffing timidly at the unfamiliar smell of him. Daniel was reminded that the door must be mended before it was too dark to see. The goat circled the room and found Leah, and he saw her hand go out and her fingers grip the black fur. Night was coming on. He mended the door after a fashion and propped it against the frame. Then he discovered that there was no oil in the lamp. How many nights had they gone without a light? He had not thought to ask Rosh for money, and though it was too dark now to search the room, he doubted there would be a single coin hidden there. Just as darkness fell, there was a timid knock on the door. The second neighbor, the one who had most feared the devils, held out to him a small saucer of oil with a flaming wick. He accepted the lamp with shame. Through all these years, when he had thought of the village, he had remembered the poverty, the dinginess, the quarreling and meanness and despair. He had forgotten that there was kindness too. He put the lamp on the floor and sat down near his grandmother's mat. He was all at once very tired, more tired than after a day at the forge or a long hunt over the mountain. Dread began to creep along his nerves again. He knew he was terribly afraid to spend the night in this place. Rush was right. There was a weakness in him, that devil of fear that held his sister helpless. Was it cunning enough to find out his weakness? If he could run out into the street, back to the mountain, it could never overtake him. But he could not run. He could only sit while the fear reached closer and closer, hemming in the small circle of light that held it at bay. Sometimes his grandmother stirred, the thin, wrinkled eyelids opened, and the faded eyes groped toward him. If he spoke to her, she closed her eyes again, satisfied. How had she been so sure that he would come? What had he ever done for her that she would dare to believe he would come back? He wished now he could tell her why he had run away. He wished that he could explain about Rosh, could let her know that it was for her, too, that he worked on the mountain. But it was too late for that. The only thing he could do was to sit here beside her, to let her be sure that he was there. Perhaps if she could hear him, she would not have to make such an effort to see. He began to talk, and as he had talked that night to Samson while he filed off the chains, not knowing whether anyone heard or understood, but out of some need in himself. You thought I had forgotten, he said, but I remember how it used to be when Leah and I first came to live with you. Your hair was still so black, grandmother. You worked in the Kitsa field that summer, but at night you used to tell us stories. There was no sound, not from the still figure or from the corner, but it was his imagination that a faint softening, almost like a smile, relaxed the thin, tight lips. He went on talking. You were the one who told me the story of Daniel, the prophet I was named for, how when Daniel refused to stop praying to his God, Darius cast him into a den of lions, and how God sent an angel and shut the lions' mouths, and Daniel was not hurt. And about the 3 men who walked in the fiery furnace, and not a hair of their heads was singed. I can remember their names still: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I used to like the sound of them. You made me feel proud of being named Daniel. There was a faint stir in the corner. Daniel did not turn his head. He went on talking. At night, before we went to sleep, you made us repeat a psalm after you. I have forgotten them now, but there's one I think I could remember, the one you liked the best. He fumbled for the words, and they came slowly from the depths of his memory. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. There was a hesitant footstep beside him. Not knowing what to do, not daring to look up, with the cold prickle of fear along his skin, Daniel held out his hand. He felt Leah's fingers touch his own. He forced himself to go on. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Leah sank down beside him. Side by side, without speaking, the brother and sister sat and listened to the breathing of the old woman. Leah's hand in his own was like the hand of a small child reaching out to him in trust and helplessness. It was a sign that even now the devils did not have complete dominion. Fear retreated into the shadowy corners. There were only the small sounds, the hiss of the wick in the saucer of oil, the wheezing and sighing of the sleeping goat, the ceaseless rustling in the thatch overhead where countless small creatures nested in the molding straw. Once the thin thread of a snake swung down, twisted back on itself, and disappeared. A rat came out of the shadows, sat on its haunches, and glared at them. Leah looked at them both without surprise or alarm. Sometime in the night he was aware that one sound in the room had ceased. His grandmother was no longer breathing. Chapter 11. I think we're early enough in that we can go ahead and read chapter 11. So, and okay. Next morning, a meager funeral procession straggled through the village toward the burial ground outside the gates. There were no flutes, no hired mourners, only a scattering of neighbor women wailing half-heartedly, and the trundling cart that carried the body of the old woman. Leading the procession was the lone mourner, a broad-shouldered young man with a fierce, forbidding scowl. After the burial was over, Daniel, turning homeward, saw a hurrying figure coming from the village, and presently, with a burst of gratitude, he recognized his friend, the blacksmith. "I'm sorry, my friend," Simon said, wringing his hand. "I tried to get here in time for the burial. I'll go back to your house with you if you don't mind." Simon was the only guest at the funeral feast which the neighbors spread outside the house. They ate in silence, and when the women had cleared away the dishes and left them alone, Simon turned to Daniel. "What now?" he asked. "Is there more to be done?" Daniel asked wearily. "I meant tomorrow. What are you going to do?" Daniel looked away. Since he had received Simon's message, he had managed not to ask himself that question. "I had another reason for coming today," Simon went on. "I told you in Capernaum that I intended to follow Jesus, but it weighs on my conscience that the smithy is closed. The money does not matter. I've learned to do without that, but it worries me that the tools lie idle, while the men have no one to mend their plows. It has been on my mind for some time that you might help me. If you could take over the shop while I'm gone, keep the place from going to seed, I'd be grateful to you." It was like Simon to make it sound like a favor. Daniel stared down at the road, kicked up a spurt of dust with his bare foot. He was almost at the point of tears, yet in the same instant such a fierce resentment sprang up in him that he dared not look his friend in the face. They had it all worked out for him. Everyone, the doctor, Leah, the neighbors, and now Simon, took it for granted that he had come home to stay. Did he have nothing to say about it? What about his life on the mountain? What about Rosh and Samson and the work that must be done in the cave? Wasn't that more important than a few farmers who wanted their wheels mended? Everything he loved, the wind on the mountaintop, the irresponsible life, the excitement of the raids, rose up and fought off the shackles that Simon held out to him in kindness. The battle did not last long. He was trapped. Simon knew he was trapped. Though he longed to defy them all and fight for his freedom like a mountain wolf, the weakest one of them had defeated him. He could not leave Leah to sit alone in the house with a door barred. Simon, who had waited without speaking a word, was carefully looking off down the narrow street when Daniel finally raised his eyes. "Will they bring their business to me?" the boy asked miserably. "They will depend on you," Simon smiled. "If I can find someone to care for Leah while I work." "I had thought of that too," Simon said. "My house is connected with the shop. No use having it empty. Why don't you both move in there and use my things? Better to have her where you could keep an eye on her yourself." Not a word about the crumbling mud or the sagging roof or the gaping door which Simon could see plainly from where he stood. Daniel's throat suddenly ached. "Thank you," he managed. "It is good." "It's just good business," Simon said crisply. "I'm sure of your work. I know my reputation is in good hands." He went on, in a practical tone, explaining some of the problems of the trade, the work that this or that man was likely to demand. "One more thing," he added. "From time to time, not often, one of the legionaries comes into the shop for something, a broken harness or a clasp. They have their own forge at the garrison, of course, but Sometimes a man needs a repair done quickly. Daniel bristled. I will never serve a pig of a Roman. Yes, said Simon levelly, you will serve him, and civilly, too. There is something you will have to learn, my friend. An outlaw may think he is accountable to no one, but in a village every man holds his neighbor's safety in his hands. If a legionary is in a mood for trouble, any excuse will do. A single insult could cost half the lives in the town in the end. This is one thing I must ask of you. To Daniel it seemed the final blow that struck his shackles into place. Simon laughed. It's not so bad as all that. After all, a horse deserves a comfortable bridle, whether he belongs to a Roman or not. Besides, a good zealot does not bring down suspicion on his roof. Daniel looked at his friend sharply. Did Simon mean Did you think you had to give up serving your country? All the patriots don't live in the mountain. There are zealots in blacksmith shops. Do what you will, the place is yours now. So long as no harm comes to my neighbors. Can I count on you for that? You can count on that, the boy said, feeling a measure of hope and a great gratitude toward his friend. I'm going back to Capernaum tonight, Simon said. Perhaps you can find a neighbor to help you move your things. Before dark, Daniel climbed the mountain and explained to Rosh that he must stay in the village. Rosh heard him out in silence. Then he spoke. This witless sister is more important than your country's freedom? Daniel flushed. No, but I cannot leave her alone. They boast of charity in the synagogue, don't they? Let them care for her. Daniel remembered the untouched loaves of bread tossed through the window. She would starve, he said. I have said it before, Rosh said with scorn. You are soft. This time Daniel did not look away. He faced his chief levelly. I will prove you are wrong, he said quietly. I will work for the cause in the village. You will see. I belong here on the mountain. I'll never forget that. But now I'm going back, and tomorrow I will move into the house of Simon the Zealot. Next morning he cleared out the little house. There was practically nothing worth taking. Surely there had been more than this in the days when he had lived with his grandmother. He remembered very clearly a blue glazed dish she had cherished, and a red woolen rug that had hung against the wall. Probably she had sold them for food. The decent and usable things he could salvage from the whole house went into a very small pack. Since his grandmother had died, Leah had sat quietly, waiting, her hands folded. Like a small child, she did as she was told, ate what he brought to her. Will grandmother be hungry? She asked once. No, Daniel answered. Is it cold where she is? She will never be hungry or cold again, he promised her. Now he explained to her as gently as he could that they must move. Simon's house is much nicer than this. It will keep out the rats and the rain and the cold in the winter. You will have a mattress to sleep on like a rich girl. She listened with wide, unfathomable blue eyes, and he thought she understood. But when the moment came to leave, he saw that he was mistaken. As soon as he opened the door, she shrank from the sunlight as though it were a sword. Outside, in the roadway, a handful of neighbors had gathered to watch his departure. One glimpse of them sent Leah cowering against a wall. Nothing Daniel could say persuaded her to move a step. Daniel's impatience mounted. He was tempted to pick her up and carry her without any nonsense, but some instinct told him that if he laid a finger on her by force, he might never win her back again. Finally, he went out to speak to the neighbors. It's no good, he told them. She can't abide being looked at. We could never get across the town. I will have to leave her here alone while I'm working. Better tie her up, one man advised, keeping the width of the road between him and the house. Kin of mine has a daughter is possessed. They've kept her on a chain all her life. Daniel shook his head. He'd seen such people, poor raving creatures tied up to trees like dogs. Before he put a rope on Leah, he would stay in this house till it crumbled to pieces around them. He went back into the house and slammed the door behind him, sending a shower of dust and clay across the floor. In the afternoon, he answered a cautious knock. Just outside the door stood a vehicle so extraordinary that he stood peering out at it, not realizing what it could be. An aged carpenter who lived a short way down the road stood beside the thing, grinning. "It's a litter," he explained, "like those fancy Roman ladies ride around in. Lift your sister in, and she'll be as snug as in her own bed. My wife sewed all our cloaks together to make the curtains. There's 4 men ready to carry it for you, but we'll stay out of sight till she's inside." A lump pushed up against Daniel's throat. Once again he felt shamed. Why should they show such kindness to a stranger and an outcast? When every neighbor had tactfully vanished from the street, Daniel inveigled Leah into inve, that's an interesting word. Inveiggled. Daniel inveigled Leah into taking one look through the door. "That's the way queens travel," he told her, "the way the Queen of Sheba came to visit King Solomon. You will sit inside it, and we'll pull the curtains tight around you. In no time at all, we'll be at the new house." She shook her head. He did not hurry her. He could see that her curiosity was piqued. From time to time, the blue eyes slanted toward the door. "No one can see me in there," she asked. Sorry, "no one can see me in there?" What is he going to do about Leah? Oh, yeah, okay. "No one can see me in there?" she finally asked. "Not so much as your little finger." "Do I have to go away from here, Daniel?" "I want you to be near me when I work. Wouldn't you like that, Leah?" After a long time she seemed to give in. She moved toward the door and stood, still terrified. Then, before she could refuse again, Daniel picked her up. She hid her face against his shoulder, whimpering, but she did not scream. He lifted her gently into the little box and drew the curtains around her shuddering figure. So Leah traveled across the village like a queen. Behind her strode Daniel, carrying the sack that held all their belongings and leading the small goat by its tether. A neighbor boy carried the loom, the only valuable thing that Leah possessed. There was so much work to do in the new house that he scarcely had time to think of the cave. Very early in the morning, before the women and girls were likely to be about, he carried the water jars to the well. This was not a man's job, nor was the sweeping or the cooking or the washing of clothes. Still, these things had to be done after a fashion. He had learned to take care of himself in the cave, where there had been no women to wait on them. But everything was more complicated here in the village, and in addition there was Leah to provide for. The moment the shop door was open, villagers appeared with work they had saved for Simon's return. They watched the strange young blacksmith with suspicion, waiting to see what he could do. Daniel took up the challenge. He could not deny that it was a satisfaction to step every moment it was a satisfaction to step every morning into Simon's tidy shop, stocked with bars of iron and hung with rows of tongs and chisels and hammers. For 5 years Daniel had smelted his own ore and fashioned it with clumsy makeshift tools. He had never realized that he was learning to make up in skill what he lacked in equipment. After a little practice, he discovered that he could make Simon's tools do just what he wanted them to do. The work he turned out was true and light and strong. Word went round that the new smith was a good worker for all his fierce, unapproachable scowl. With money in his pocket for the first time in his life, he was able to buy meat from the butcher and round, flat loaves of barley bread from the baker. He did not eat as well as he had on the mountain, where meat from the farmers' flocks had been free for the plundering, but he suspected that Leah had never known such plenty. Once the shock of the journey and the terror of the new house were away, Leah settled down unprotestingly. She began to take pleasure in the very small things, in combing her long fair hair, in arranging the row of jars along the shelf, in watching the pattern of sunbeams along the plaster wall. She reminded him of Samson, the way she did not want to let him out of her sight. Odd, he thought, how he had shaken that great black shadow only to be chained now to a little gray one, scarcely bigger than a mouse, but inescapable. Leah insisted that the door between the house and the shop be left open. For hours on end she sat and watched him through the opening. When customers entered the shop, she would disappear, waiting concealed in the corner till they had gone. Sometimes he suspected that she watched them too from behind the long yellow hair. Daniel was concerned that she was idle all day long. He urged her to work at the loom, but though she was willing, she had no notion where to procure the thread. Her grandmother had brought her thread and taken away the finished cloth. That was all she knew. One morning, however, a man called at the shop, not with a tool to be mended, but with skeins of fine linen. He was the servant of a wealthy widow in Chorazin, who, it appeared, had brought all the cloth that Leah had woven, had bought all the cloth that Leah had woven. Daniel had assumed that charitable people had bought Leah's work out of pity. He was astonished to learn that this woman knew or knew or cared nothing about his sister, and desired the cloth for its fine quality. The servant was much relieved to have tracked down the weaver. Daniel set up the loom in the corner so that, sitting before it, Leah could see through the open door into his shop. Then he watched with amazement as she threaded it with expert fingers. One morning, when business was slack, Daniel discovered a measure of wheat flour on Simon's shelf and decided to try his hand at bread making. Sorry. He lighted a fire in the clay oven outside the door, measured out a little pile of the flour, stirred in some water, and began to pat the lumpy mixture into a flat cake, trying to remember how his mother had once done it. Absorbed in the work, he was startled when two small hands suddenly thrust themselves into the mixture. "That's not the way," Leah said softly. She patted the lump on a flat stone, rolled it deftly with a flat roller which she took from the shelf, and handed him the thin circle of dough ready to plaster against the wall of the oven. It gave off a delicious fragrance as it baked, and came from the oven crusty and satisfying. After that, they made their own bread together, and saved the money that had gone to the baker. She taught him how to save a bit of dough for leavening for the next day's baking. An even greater surprise was to come. Behind the house, Simon had planted a small plot of vegetables, enough to supply his own solitary table. Through the luxuriant tangle of weeds which had sprouted untended, Daniel had glimpsed the shiny green of a cucumber, and one evening, after he had closed the shop, he went out to clear away the weeds and see what else might be hiding there. He had worked for some time, liking the feel of the green plants and the smell of the earth, when he felt a soft footstep behind him, and suddenly Leah knelt beside him, thrusting her hands into the green leaves as she had thrust them into the dough. "Don't, Daniel," she said. "You are pulling up all the carrots." He watched her, almost afraid to speak. "See," she showed him. "These red leaves are beets, and these are onions. All the rest are weeds." After that, Leah spent many of the daylight hours in the garden, hidden by the high surrounding wall. Her pale cheeks took on a faint golden tinge. Blowing up his fire in the shop, Daniel pondered. without the faintest idea what had really gone on in that dim, shuttered house behind the cheesemakers. He had taken for granted that Leah had lost her wits on the terrible night of her childhood. Was he any better, he thought now with shame, than the neighbors who would have tied her with ropes? Nor could he blame his grandmother? She had been grief-stricken and worked to the bone, terrified by the child's screaming spells, afraid to trust her with any household tasks. Now he saw that Leah remembered accurately almost everything she had watched her grandmother do. Praise be, she could take over most of the work of the house from now on, and he would feel more like a man. Yet as the days went by, he saw that he had been too quickly encouraged. The weaving progressed at a snail's pace. The slightest efforts exhausted the girl. She was often fretful, complaining of the horrid men who came into the shop and demanding that he lock the door against them. He could not get it through her head that he had a business to carry on. At a moment when she seemed most contented, a knock at the door, a shout in the distance, the most trivial sound could reduce her to utter helplessness, and it might be hours or even days before she would so much as pick up a spoon. On other days she swept out the house, combed her hair, and sat passing the shuttle through the threads for hours. Daniel gave up trying to understand her and accepted her as he had accepted Samson, as a burden he was doomed to carry. Late one afternoon, Daniel looked up to see a legionary standing in the doorway. He had almost forgotten Simon's warning, but even as his hammer arm stiffened, he remembered and laid down the hammer on the stone. He did not spit, but there were other ways of showing his contempt. He bent over his work, absorbed in it, sanding over and over an imaginary flaw on the surface of the smooth metal. Finally, in his own good time, he raised his head. He saw that he had made his point. The soldier's face had flushed an angry red, but he said nothing. Doubtless he too was under orders to preserve the peace. "My horse has a broken bridle ring," the soldier said in stilted, reasonably good Aramaic. Daniel reached for the thing as though it were a scorpion. "It will take some time," he muttered. "Come for it tomorrow." "I need it at once," the Roman answered. "I will wait for it now." Daniel studied him, trying to assess how much delay the man would tolerate. Then, with a shrug, he set to work. The sooner the job was done, the sooner his shop would be rid of the man. The soldier did not sit down on the bench by the door as ordinary customers did. He hesitated through pride. Daniel would not admit that it might be decency, waiting to be asked. Let him rot away on his feet, Daniel thought. He would get no such invitation in this shop. Turning his back, Daniel seized the bellows and blew up the fire. When he straightened again, the Roman was pulling off his helmet, revealing crisp, fair hair. He wiped the back of his hand across the wet forehead where the metal had left an uncomfortable-looking crease. With a shock, Daniel saw that he was very young, certainly no older than Joel. The beardless cheeks and chin scarcely needed a razor. His skin was white, mottled, and peeling from exposure to the sun, so that he could not have seen service long under Galilean skies. The eyes that stared back at Daniel were a clear, bright blue. He looked as though he might be about to speak, and Daniel turned his back and resumed his work. He took a ridiculously long time for the simple job. When finally he turned again, the soldier still stood, looking hot and uncomfortable, swinging the bronze helmet from one hand. He was no longer looking at the anvil, and Daniel, swinging to follow that intense blue gaze, suddenly stiffened with horror. The door to Simon's house stood open. Leah, who had surely not known the man was there, was coming through the little rear door from the garden, her hands full of green lettuce. The long golden hair streamed around her shoulders, lighted up all around her head from the sunlight behind her. Her eyes, blue as the kitsa blossoms, were empty with surprise. Before she could shrink back, with one lunge Daniel slammed the door between them. Murderous hate boiled up in him. How dare the man look at his sister? The very touch of his eyes had defiled her, as surely as though he had touched her with his hand. Daniel was quivering as he handed over the bridle ring. It took every ounce of his will not to hurl the coin back into the blonde face. That night he began again to think of the mountain. Chapter 12, we'll read tomorrow. The first word is late. So, and we will start that one tomorrow. I hope you're enjoying the story. The Bronze Bow by Elizabeth Speare. It's a good one. All right, so what is he going to do about Leia? Well, I guess that was answered. So sad. Yes, it's sad. It was his grandmother. There's no telling how old she was, but she wasn't probably very healthy for a lot of reasons. How long is it? Oh, the chapter. About 25 minutes. I just finished it. This is the way. Yes. Yes, it is. All right. So, thank you for joining us tonight. Tomorrow I will, sorry. Tomorrow I'll try to be more on top of things. However, tomorrow I think there's a presidential debate, so we will have and I know Kimmy's flying home, but I think she should be home pretty early before the reading starts. So anyway, regardless, I think that we may or may not skip tomorrow, but I'll let everybody know in a text message. So anyway, God bless you guys. We'll see you either tomorrow or Friday, one or the other, and have a good night. Goodbye.